Hey there, it's Chris from Good Roads, and I've done a lot of work on the channel pressing decks with handmade foam molds. I've done skateboards, longboards, pow surfers, I even pressed a full-blown snowboard. And I've been working under an assumption about this style of mold, and I've shared that assumption here on the channel many times, and the assumption is this, that using a rough cut two-part foam mold like this, you can't really get a good veneer deck. And for good reason. Typically, to use this style of mold, you need a material like Baltic birch plywood that has some kind of inherent stiffness that will help compensate for all the divots and imperfections in the surface of the mold. A lot of bad decks pressed by really talented shapers will give evidence to that. A lot of people have tried, and a lot of people have failed, including me. But I think I might have cracked this particular problem, so I'm gonna challenge that assumption. Today, I'm gonna press a really good veneer skateboard using a dirt cheap two-part styrofoam mold. The first thing I'm gonna need to make my deck is a mold. And to get started, I'm cutting both my foam and a set of backing boards to size. I've believed for a long time that foam molds are a great tool for quick testing and prototyping of experimental board shapes, and that's what I'm gonna be doing with this build. I'm not a good skater, it's just a fact. And I've been thinking a lot about why. Outside of needing more practice, of course, it also occurred to me that I always feel really unstable on a typical street style board. Coming from mountain boarding and longboarding, the standard street wheelbase feels very narrow to me. So how would it feel to ride a deck with a more typical geometry that simply has a longer wheelbase? So that's what I'm gonna try. I'm gonna make myself a big boaty pool or cruiser deck with a slightly longer than normal wheelbase. To those ends, I used a spare street deck as a reference to design my molds. I laid down a center line and a midline to help me with measurements, then marked my nose and tail. Next, I marked my concave. The easiest concave to do with this style of mold is a flat or tub concave, though if you get creative, you can do more complex shapes as well. For this build, I'll be doing a fairly deep, flat concave. The angles I'm putting at the end of the concave are to make what's called the pocket, that flat section of the deck between the concave and the kicktails. Beyond being useful for flip tricks, this transition actually serves an important purpose in board construction. Wood only likes to bend in one direction at a time. If you try bending it in two directions, it'll want to split. So the pocket of a deck is there to give the veneers a chance to rest between the curves of the concave and the curves of the kicktails. And for this mold, that's all the layout I'm gonna do. For this experiment, I am intentionally making a very rough mold, and this angular geometric design is about as easy to make as it gets. Once everything's laid out, it's time to cut the mold. I'm starting with my concave, and guys, I'm using an old, dull sawzall blade. Building skateboards doesn't have to be fancy or expensive. Use what you've got. When you're cutting out your foam, do your best to cut accurately along the lines and save your cutoffs because those are going to be the female half of your mold. I switched over to a dirt cheap handsaw to cut the nose and tail, and here you can see how shoddy this mold is going to be. My planes aren't quite straight, the surfaces are pitted and rough, certainly not high precision work by any means. I marked my nose and tail wedges so that I didn't get them mixed up, and then moved over to assembling the molds. I need to back the foam on some wood to give it the stiffness required to stand up to the pressures needed to press a deck. The male side is as straightforward as can be. I simply glued it onto its backing board and used some heavy stuff to weigh it down while the glue set. And the female side isn't much harder. You just glue the cutoffs in place so that they match the sections they were cut from in the male mold. And that's it. The molds are done. Seriously, they're done. These rough cut, uneven, poorly matched molds are what I'm going to use to press a legit maple skateboard deck, and here's how I'm going to do it. This is a soft EVA foam rubber mat. You can find them in the back of most Home Depots and other home goods stores. They're mostly used in workstations like kitchens where you're on your feet all day and you need to cushion hard concrete floors. In this case, I'm going to put it between my foam molds and the maple veneer. The thinking is the firm but flexible foam will fill in the gaps and imperfections in the mold to give us a smooth, even distribution of clamping force so that we can get a really good press for the deck. I cut my foam rubber sheets so they'd fit in my press, and then it was time to run this experiment. I grabbed a standard set of 7 maple skate veneers that I got from rawrocket.com and started rolling out my glue. Once my layup was glued, I moved it over to my press where the bottom half of my mold and the first sheet of foam were waiting. I dropped the second foam sheet and the top half of the mold in place and got pressing. You can almost certainly use bar clamps to press a board this way, but this style of spar press is super cheap and simple to build and makes the job much easier. I'll link to a video on how to put one together. With that done, I clamped down my press and we're looking pretty good. I'm not seeing many gaps, and I am seeing some glue squeeze out, which is always a good sign. Here's the rub with this technique though. Since I'm relying on the foam rubber getting crushed to even out the mold, I lose quite a bit of control over the shape of the final deck. Pressing a board this way means you can never really get the exact curves you put in the molds. They're always going to be a little more gradual and mellow than whatever you design. But that's a trade-off that might just be worth making. I left the board in the press for a day for the glue to cure, and then came back and cracked it open. Interesting. That looks like it worked. Man, that is a deep concave. Oh boy. I didn't mean for that to happen. The blank looks pretty dang promising. It was feeling a little damp, so I gave it another few days out of the mold to drive out any leftover moisture from the glue, and then it was time to shape. I had transferred the marks from my center line from the mold to the deck, and I used those to drop the center line of my board in place. A while back, I did an experiment making some fingerboards, and I said that I wanted to make one of those shapes full size. So that's what I'm gonna do here, a big, boaty, fish-style deck. Then it's over to the bandsaw to cut it out. For a prototype like this, I'm happy to just get it as close as I can with the bandsaw to save myself from having to refine the shape on the belt sander. It may not be perfect, but it'll be good enough so that I can tell what I do and don't like about the shape. And here's where things start to get exciting. Those glue lines look flawless. There's no delamination anywhere, which means we've probably got a perfectly good deck on our hands. Next, I marked out my wheelbase and drilled my truck mounting holes using my Scarab bolt hole guide, available at goodroadscollective.com. I've also got a free paper template if you're on a budget, but the Scarab really does get great results. Then I rounded my rails using the Bishop domed router mount, also available at, you guessed it, goodroadscollective.com. Which makes an easy job of an otherwise laborious task. But you can totally do this with files and sandpaper. I did it that way for years, it just takes some elbow grease. Then it's over to the sanding drum to clean up the rails. And an orbital sander to smooth everything else out. And the blank is done. All that's left is to add some art and a finish, and it's time to test it out. I got it set up with my homemade set of pool wheels and took it out for a spin. And remember, there were kind of two experiments going on here. The main one was the pressing technique, but I also wanted to see if I felt more stable riding a wider wheelbase. So I threw a couple ollies in just to see. And yeah, honestly, that does feel a lot better to me. If anything, I probably went a little bit too wide on the wheelbase, but I'll have to do more experimentation to find out. And how about that press? Dude, I can't believe it. I was 100% wrong. You can totally press a legit high quality veneer deck using a foam mold. You just have to be willing to sacrifice a little bit of accuracy, and you have to get yourself some foam rubber. I am so stoked about this. Not only is this probably gonna be my go-to prototyping technique from now on, but it's so accessible. This is such an easy way for anyone out there who wants to step up and start working with the kind of materials that are used in professionally made decks. Costs almost nothing, and you can get really, really good results. I slapped this mold set together in an afternoon for probably 20 bucks of materials, and look at the results. I had a completely custom deck in the press in a matter of hours. Totally sick. So that's gonna do it for this week. I had a ton of fun pressing and testing this DIY pool deck. I hope you guys can see how easy it can be to really get out there and make your own boards. And I hope that you take the information in this video and you do just that. Get out there, start making your own hardware. If you've got questions or comments, leave them down below. If you want to see more awesome DIY board sport projects, just go ahead and hit subscribe. Huge shout out, as always, to my supporters over on Patreon. It's your contributions that keep the shop flush with materials and allow me to keep tackling these projects week after week. If you'd like to support the channel, there'll be a link down in the description below. As always, I love having you guys along for the ride. Love it. So until next time, I'll see you soon. What are you doing? Why are you doing that? Don't do that. Don't do that. I tell you not to do that, you don't do that. Instead of doing it, don't do that. We're not friends anymore. We're not, you and I, we are not friends anymore. See, this is my new friend. You are not my friend. This is my friend.